Hello, welcome to Pro Tips number 53, where I'll be talking about discovering startup applications. Now in Lansweeper, startup applications are already scanned by default. However, if you're more familiar with Lansweeper, you might know them as the item called auto start. In Lansweeper, like I mentioned, they're already scanned by default, but only scanned every 30 days if you're using automated scanning targets. So we're going to take a look today at exactly how you can change that behavior, also how you can enable history of scanning the auto start applications, as well as I'll show you a dashboard that I've created, some customized reports, and something a little bit more in depth, which is I'll show you how you can retrieve the actual status of the startup applications as well, which is a bit more customized, but we'll dive into all of that right now. So we're starting on Lansweeper on-premise, where we'll have to start in order to adjust the time or the frequency of how frequent we scan the startup applications. And you'll find that under scanning. If you've seen multiple of these pro tips, you've probably seen this one already. Under scanning, there's the scanned item interval. This is only for Windows. It'll let you adjust which items are scanned for Windows, how frequently they are rescanned, and whether history is enabled or not. And luckily, because we're working with the item that starts with an A, Autorun is at the top. So you can enable history here, which I would recommend you do. And then the refresh will default be on 30. You can lower it to whatever value you want. Obviously, this is a number that represents the number of days before the item is rescanned. If you put it to 0, like I have here, it means it gets rescanned during every single scan. Just a tidbit of extra information. These schedules and these timings are not taken into account when you do manual rescans. Manual rescans will always scan every single item that is at least enabled. So that's something to take into account. But things like when it triggers during your scanning schedules that you have for your IP range scanning targets or any different kind of scanning targets, the kind of automated ones, the automated triggers that happen, those will take these values into account. So I've moved it to 0, so it gets scanned every single time. I've enabled the history, and that way, as I'll show you later on, we'll also be able to see exactly when new startup applications get added somewhere in your environment. So I'm going to head back to the dashboard just to give you an overview of kind of the things that I've created, and then I'll go through some of the things and how I've set them up. At the very top here, we see a chart that I've created, enabled startup applications. As I mentioned, I have created a way that you can also scan the status. By default, status of the startup application is not scanned, just which startup applications are available on your devices. On the right-hand side, I created a chart as well that shows you the number of times a specific startup application appears in your environment. So you can basically see which startup applications are the most popular within your environment. In our case, I think with this security health one is one that's pretty default on Windows itself. And then second to that is the VMware user process. We have a lot of virtual machines in this specific demo environment, so that's why that one comes up a lot. And then the third one here is some kind of Azure startup application that's there as well. But as you can see, I've sorted it by total number, so you can quite easily see what the most popular ones are and what the least popular ones are. And it'll also let you sift through it and go through the data just to see if there's any applications in there that you might want to blacklist or remove from certain devices. Then the second one here, which is just a report that I've embedded on this dashboard, is just a simple overview of all of the startup applications and the assets that they're on. So it's very simple, just asset and startup applications. There's not much special there, but it's good as a template that you can use to then create your own specific reports. You'll notice when you go to reports, we actually already had some built-in reports on startup applications. As I mentioned, we call them, or they're historically named Autorun. But all of these reports that we had previously, they're all very specific to a specific application, like you see here, iTunes or Google, things like that. We didn't have one general one that just shows you everything. So I've created one general one that just shows you everything so that you can then use that to start filtering for specific things or just to search through some of the columns if you want to. Below that, we have the startup application status. As I mentioned, I've figured out a way, or I've created a way basically for you to scan the status. I'll get into the details of that after we've gone through this overview. And I've joined that together with the data that we scan already by default from the auto start or the startup applications. And then at the bottom is the historical one here. So this basically just gives you the name of the startup application, the action, whether it was added or removed from that device, and then specifically the timestamp of when that happened. As you can see, that will basically let you configure it. By default, this one is filtered on 7 days, so it shows data from the last 7 days. You can adjust it to fit whatever kind of days you want. You could add an additional filter to only show the ones that were added. You can turn it into a report where basically you get to see which startup applications were added in the last 7 days, which is interesting to know, especially when it comes to security, because there will be some malicious programs, executables, and things like that that will automatically add themselves to the startup application list, so that every time that the user starts up their machine, the malicious software also gets automatically started up in the background somewhere. And this is a good way to keep an eye on that. If you see any weird entries come in here, you'll know to take a closer look at that device and probably remove it. You could do the same thing with if you have like an approved list of software. You could double check that or cross check that with this list to ensure that no unapproved software basically is being added to that startup list, which serves pretty much the same purpose. And then at the bottom, this could either be a chart or it could be a report, simply because this will have a lot of entries, but it's a report that shows you the number of startup applications per asset. So this is more to keep an eye on which devices might have a lot of startup items, meaning that if they do have a lot of them, most likely that means that the user will experience some sort of impact on their boot process, how long it takes for their device to actually finish booting up and being really usable for them. So if there are devices in here with a large number, it could mean that that user is more likely to submit tickets via your IT help desk or something because they're experiencing issues or slowdowns during their boot up process of their device. So this is more of a way to prevent issues or prevent your users from complaining that their boot up is slow or it takes a long time, things like that. And it also allows you to free up some resources on those devices. If a lot of background applications are running all the time that aren't really needed or aren't supposed to run all the time, it'll also hog up a lot of resources. And again, that can cause users to submit tickets and create more work for you. So this is more in order to prevent work from occurring or landing in your lap later on. Now, when it comes to the specific piece on getting the status, because that's kind of one of the critical components here. That's the most custom component that I'll be talking about. All of the other stuff that I've shown, every single report that doesn't have the status specifically in it, you can get that out of the box. Only thing I would say is obviously enable the history, lower that frequency to 1 day or even put it to 0 like I did. But if you want the status, we'll need to do some extra steps. This is very similar to an earlier pro tip that I did where I figured out how to basically distinguish between a hard drive and an SSD. This will be a very similar process, basically meaning that I created a PowerShell script that goes through your registry, because the status of a startup application is stored in different registry keys. Some are in the user area, some are in just the local machine area. But I've made a script that goes through all the keys that are known. It then captures that information and stores it in a generally available registry key that you can then add to your scanning configuration. So basically, you'll find the script linked in the blog version of the pro tips. And as always, it's a PowerShell script. You can look at the code yourself. You can inspect it yourself to see what it does if you don't trust me. But once you have the script, you can basically deploy it to all of your devices, to select specific devices where you want to monitor it closer. It's up to you how you use that script itself, but let's show you here the scanning setup. So we have to go to File and Registry Scanning, where, I have quite a long list because I've done multiple similar things already, but it's here at the bottom where you'll see the H key local machine and then system startup. That's the key that I've let the script create, and that's where it stores all the data. I've added then values from 0 to 20. This is with the assumption that no device will have more than 20 startup items. If you have a scenario, if you notice in the reports that I've shared that there are devices that are hitting that 20 limit, you might want to add a few more just in case there are devices that go over that 20 limit. Obviously, if you only have 20, it will max out at 20. So I would always recommend taking a look and seeing if any devices max out, add a few on top of it just to make sure that you're capturing everything. But if you've got this one set up, it will let you basically scan all of the machines. If any startup applications or the status of any startup applications have been scanned, then you'll also see that in your data. Let's take a look here and shift over to an asset and show you exactly. If I go here to scanned info registry keys and then do a search here, if it'll let me out, there's a search indeed for startup, then I can see here exactly what kind of data we get back. So it basically, in the value, you'll see the data that I get back. It basically gives you the name of the startup application and then a series of digits. Usually this will just be the first digit is the important one that will indicate whether it's enabled or not. It took a lot of figuring out because Microsoft is not very good with their documentation on this stuff. But even numbers means enabled, uneven numbers means disabled. But I've written that all into the report as you might have seen earlier. If I go back here to the dashboard, the Autorun applications, and then let's see the startup application status. You'll see here that in the status I've just have enabled, disabled, or unknown. Unknown obviously meaning that device, or the script hasn't been run on that device, or the registry keys haven't been scanned on that device. So it's likely that will likely be the cause of an unknown, but otherwise we could tell you whether it's enabled or disabled, and then you can also filter additionally on top of that if you want to, by customizing the report, for example, or just using the columns to sort more. Once we have this data, it's pretty much just up to you to run the reports. I've already done the heavy lifting there and taking that data, splitting it up, taking a look at the number, making sure that it correlates with is it enabled or disabled. So all of that stuff is already done for you. And then it's just basically up to you to take a look at it and see if you can find any useful information there to take more action to ensure that the performance of your devices is managed better, that you don't have any device with too many startup applications, and I think one of the critical ones here is that kind of that list, the historical list of devices that got new startup applications added or removed, but the added one is the interesting one there, to prevent any malware, any malicious applications to appear on your devices without your knowledge, or that don't require any kind of admin credentials to run, and they just kind of sit in the background of your users' devices and do whatever they're doing, basically. Now, aside from all of the on-prem stuff here that I'm showing, I also have made a few reports in cloud. There are a couple of small adjustments or changes to that, but I'll jump over to that interface as well. So here in my site, if you are using a Lansweeper site, it's a bit easier because you won't have to manually import the reports that I've created. That will already be there. All you have to do is search for startup, and that will show you all the startup applications, one that I'm showing off here as well. They're very similar for the most part. So I've got the kind of general overview, or like the one that shows you the number of startup applications per device. There we go. And obviously you can sort these so that you can get the biggest number at the top. And if we go back. Second, what I've also added is the overview. So this is just the list that I showed off earlier as well, more of a template, but this just shows you every single asset and the startup application that is on it with some additional data. Then we have the number of startup applications per asset, again, to figure out which devices have the most amount of startup applications on them, and that way you'll be able to figure out if there might be any future user complaints coming in or not. And then last but not least is the status one. This one is slightly different in your site than compared to on-prem. On-prem, I've been able to link the status that we scan from the registry key to the default scanning that we do, where we get the startup applications from WMI. In this report that is in your site, it is all based on the registry key. So it's a small difference, simply because of how the databases in the backend work and how easy it is to join data or not. Inside, it's a lot more difficult. So I've just opted to go here for the report that's just focused on the actual registry keys. It doesn't make it really any less accurate or more accurate. It just means that you need to ensure that you scan your registry keys before this will have any data. Otherwise, it won't have any data whatsoever. Where on the on-prem one, it will have data, but it will just be all unknowns, basically. But that's pretty much it when it comes to startup applications and everything that I've shown. I think the most important stuff here is really to kind of take away that if you're interested in getting the status of the startup application, so you know which startup applications are enabled on the devices and not just which ones are present in general. Be sure to take a look at the PowerShell script, and you can deploy that in various ways to your devices, and then you can scan the registry keys and get that status stuff. And the second thing is the history. The history is very important to get if you're interested in knowing when new startup applications get added to devices in your environment, because that's the only way to figure that out, when they get added. And that's a way that you can also then take a look at, okay, how do I use that information for potential alerting, for example? You can create report alerts on-prem for that. You can do other things with that as well. And especially you can start taking action on when or shortly after new startup applications get added that you might not want to have in your environment, basically. All right, that will be all for me this time. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.